Hello, fellow miners at the cold face of meaning, and welcome to part 2 of this week's lecture. Having sorted out the parts of the verb and how verbs can be used, we're now going to move on to what is centered on the usage of verbs. That came out wrong. What I mean is we're going to move on to the one way of revising long sentences that involves looking closely at verbs, and that is the passive voice. In this second part of the lecture, we're going to learn how to fix the passive voice. Let me enlarge it. Here we go. As we recall, some ways to define the passive voice. The passive voice is a verb construction in which things are done rather than someone doing them. And yes, I realize that this is one way, not some ways, but it is the most important way for our learning how to fix the passive voice. We use the passive voice constantly. We may not realize it, but we do it. We use the passive voice constantly in order to be indirect, and we want to be indirect in order to remove blame and to avoid naming those who are responsible. As you can see in these examples, passive voice, mistakes were made. Form of the verb to be, plus a helping verb that could be a verb in its own right. Active voice, the other guy made mistakes. You can see that in the active voice, we know who was responsible. We don't like doing that in regular conversation and often in regular writing. But in academic writing, it is not good to be indirect because, as you remember, the author's job is to retain the reader's interest for as long as the author wants it. And the active voice is a verb construction in which someone does things, which is direct, which does retain the reader's interest. As soon as you are being indirect, you are risking losing the reader's interest because you are not answering the question, who? And that is what the reader cares about, okay? You need to retain the reader's interest by being direct. So, naturally, this raises the question, how do you make the passive voice into the active voice? Okay, you begin with these two pieces of knowledge, which you already know from watching the last part of the lecture. The passive voice construction consists of the form of the verb to be plus the past participle form of another verb. This verb is helping the verb to be, so you may also think of it as a helping verb. The active voice construction, however, consists of the conjugated form of an active verb, a verb that is doing rather than being done. And the difference between these two is that the active voice contains no form of the verb to be. Let's have a look at our sample sentence. Whilst his reference to the amalgamation of blacks suggests inherent racism, it can be argued that this was a political tactic to build up to egalitarianism gradually, as this would have been ridiculed in a 19th century environment. You can see that there are two separate forms of the verb to be. It can be argued and it would have been ridiculed. You can also see that there are two past participles helping the verb to be, argued and ridiculed. Okay, form of the verb to be plus helping past participle equals passive voice. Now, let's make a change. One can argue. Someone is doing something. You will notice that there's no past participle and there's no form of the verb to be. 19th century society would have ridiculed. You will notice that there is no form of the verb to be. And therefore, with your canny deductive reasoning, you can say that the active voice contains no form of the verb to be. Unless, and this is a big caveat, unless what the person is doing is being. And we will get to that. So he is happy Perfectly fine active voice. Okay. You can begin changing the passive to the active by removing the form of the verb to be. So, in a construction, and I want to repeat this because now I'm afraid that everybody's going to be like, I need to get rid of all my forms of the verb to be. No. In a construction that contains a form of the verb to be plus a past participle helping the form of the verb to be, and preferably one which you've checked by adding by zombies after it, you can begin to change the passive to the active by removing the form of the verb to be. And as you can see, we've done that. God, I hope I'm pointing in the right direction. We've done that here. We have removed be and we have removed been. Now, what's left is your past participle. If you want to, you can note its infinitive form because this may help you. So the past participle argued, infinitive form, to argue. The past participle ridiculed, infinitive form, to ridicule. Now remember that the difference between the passive and the active is that in the passive, things are being done, but in the active, something or someone is doing something. So now, having removed the form of the verb to be, you ask yourself, is there anything in the sentence that could be doing my remaining verb? If we change it from it can be argued to simply someone is arguing, is there anything that could be doing the arguing? And the answer is not clearly. So we won't worry about it. We'll move on. Okay. The second one, this would have been ridiculed in a 19th century environment. Is there anything in that phrase that could be doing the ridiculing? The answer here is yes. The 19th century environment could be doing the ridiculing. Okay, so let's focus on this one and fix it first. Ignoring the first one, you will see that since a 19th century environment could be doing the verb ridicule, it can be your subject. The subject is the thing that does the verb. Pick up a 19th century environment, move it to the position that subjects usually take, which is in front of the verb. Now, you ask yourself, what is the thing that is being done? What is a 19th century environment ridiculing? It's a little hard to see. What is your object, the thing the verb is doing itself to? If you do not remember the difference between a subject and an object, go back to the parts of speech and parts of a sentence and have a review. Okay. However, if you do remember, you'll remember that, and you'll see that a 19th century environment would have ridiculed the political tactic to build up to egalitarianism gradually, or this. Okay, that being the case, put that in the object position. A 19th century environment would have ridiculed this. Congratulations, you now have an active verb construction. And yes, we'll get to the fact that you feel like it took you an hour to get there. Just hold on. Now, let's return to our more difficult passive voice, right? This, it can be argued, which has no obvious doer. When there is no obvious doer of the verb, ask yourself as the writer, who do I mean is doing this, or who do I mean this could be done by? It has been argued that Hamlet is indecisive. I mean that critics have argued this, okay? It could be argued that people are complex. I mean, I could argue this, or I mean that someone could argue this. Whilst his reference to the amalgamation of blacks suggests inherent racism, one can argue that this was a political tactic to build up to egalitarianism gradually, as a 19th century environment would have ridiculed this. Congratulations, you have an active verb. Old version. Whilst his reference to the amalgamation of blacks suggests inherent racism, it can be argued that this was a political tactic to build up to egalitarianism gradually, as this would have been ridiculed in a 19th century environment. New version. Whilst his reference to the amalgamation of blacks suggests inherent racism, one can argue that this was a political tactic to build up to egalitarianism gradually, as a 19th century environment would have ridiculed this. Much clearer, shorter. The old version, 37 words. The new version, 34 words. That's 3 words that you can take and use in a more useful area, almost certainly increasing the length of your quotations. Old version, long to read. New version, shorter to read. It may be only 3 words less, but it feels tighter. Old version, kind of unclear. New version, clear. Most important. Therefore, the new version is more effective, and more effective is better. Therefore, always begin revising long sentences by seeing if there are passive voice structures that you can make into active voice structures. And I said that we would talk about why it feels like it's taking an hour for you to perform this task, and the answer is because the passive voice is totally new to you. The fact that you use it all the time doesn't mean that you recognize it. And what we are doing here is recognizing and then fixing. And because we're coming from 0 recognition, the task of recognizing takes longer. As you begin to move through your work, excising the passive voice, it will get quicker and quicker and quicker because you will be recognizing faster and you know how to fix. So you'll be recognizing, fixing, recognizing, fixing. And I want to stress that this is the easiest way to make your long sentences shorter and therefore to make them less confusing. And having said that, it's the end of this portion of the lecture. And I don't know if you noticed, but I messed it up last time. So I'm going to get it right this time. And I'm going to say, just a moment, I'm going to say, who's got 2 thumbs and just taught you how to fix the passive voice? That's right, this gal. But who's got 2 index fingers and can now go through all their essays fixing the passive voice? That's right, you! All right, I'll catch you on the flip side.